Welcome back. Both Chinese and Indian people have a legendary capacity for hard work, and the people who are here now have a legendary capacity for hard concentration. And you must also have a capacity to imagine that we're in a round table. We're in a square table and we're at one end of a square table, a rectangular table. But we are a round table, which I think involves more interaction, although it's been an incredibly interactive 2 days. Now, we have heard a lot about comparison. What we haven't heard much about is contrast, actually. The word contrast doesn't appear in any of the titles over the last 2 days. But comparison and contrast are inherent in the title for this session, which is about co-production, which means doing things together. Now, quite a lot of the papers over the last 2 days have been about co-production. Yeah? Not just India versus China, which there were very good examples this afternoon, but how what we know about India and China can be used to produce something that's new or something that's more generalized, a higher order something new. So that all of you who yourselves have been involved in co-producing knowledge, I invite to listen very attentively as evaluators of what our expert panelists are going to talk about, which I think is more about co-producing, the culture of co-production, the practical problems of co-production, as well as some of the more philosophical aspects of it, which have been rehearsed already. So the format for what might be almost 2 hours, but probably will be less, is that I will invite our distinguished panelists to talk for 10 or 15, maximum 15 minutes about their own particular fields. And I've been encouraged to do this wall to wall, so that if you have questions, please be patient. Very urgent questions of clarification only at the end of each presenter's time. And then we will open it up to a general discussion about all aspects of co-production with India and China as our cases. So I'm going to call first on Dr. Rajeswari Raina, whose expertise is about agriculture, small farms as we saw, and the decentralized governance of rural development, and who has experience of mounting a project on rural innovation and the variety of organizations for the governance of agriculture in India and China, and implications for policy reform. Having said that, I think that what she's going to talk about is something a little bit different, which is about education. Yes? Over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. It's great to be here, and I just, some of the contrast questions that Barbara mentioned. This particular project that we did, which was together with Chinese scholars, and here is one of my members in this team. I just want to very briefly touch upon 4 points which have to do with education, but not really about education as in, let's say, university or one of those kind of, let's say, very specific organizations. But touch upon 4 questions that are broadly institutional questions about the ways in which, well, these two societies seem to, China and India, seem to be addressing, well, research options and co-production of knowledge. This project that I mentioned was specifically well designed for Indian and Chinese scholars to work together, and we had a team from the National Institute for Innovation Management, Tsinghua University. There was one person, Chinese Center for Agricultural Policy, and again from the Chen University there was one, the Center for Agriculture and Rural Development too. National Institute of Innovation Management in China was heading this, and the Chen University was heading this on the Chinese side. The Center for Policy Research, where Nimmi and I were based at that time, was heading the Indian part of it. And we had other collaborators from the Center for Development Studies, from the Gujarat Institute for Rural Development, and from the University of Hyderabad. What was different between the two of us, between the two teams, was that one was a team of social scientists. We had Nimmi from political science and international relations, we had Keshav Das and Joseph, and me from economics and social science. and Hari Babu from sociology. And the Chinese team was mainly economists and engineers, and with a very good understanding of innovation. But our questions about social sciences, about systems of change, and how these changes happened, were often it took a long time for us to get to talk to each other. But then once we started talking, there was no stopping of us, and we had to insist on getting down to work. Now, the 4 points that I want to make about in terms of contrasts in this context about why we think we had some of these difficulties. I'll draw upon my first visit to China in 1995, the conference on 100 years of China Agriculture University, a big celebration, massive conference. And my interest was basically on the reform of agricultural education, what had happened in China and how they've changed agricultural education, what are the new changes in the curriculum and so on. I was partly surprised, but not really surprised too, that anything that had to do with Marxist economics or any heterodox economics was out of the China Agriculture University syllabus at the graduate level and postgraduate level. And I could see things like, well, this should be part of the curriculum. I mean, we can't throw away all that economics. We need that, and that's part of the richness of the learning experience. And it's up to the students to decide what they want to do later. But you can't throw this out of the curriculum. Teachers, like Professor Wu Wei, who was one of the organizers of this conference, was aware of this. But he kept saying, well, we really are not allowed to do this now. We don't include these in our curriculum now. It's not needed. What you need is good production economics. You need to produce more. You need to, in other words, some of our debates in the SIID project, the Systems of Innovation for Inclusive Development project, about GM crops, about soil erosion, about community-based management of resources, kind of go back to some of these, the curriculum that our counterparts had been through or were promoting now, because there was no Marxist economics, there were no Webblanian institutionalism or Gandhian economics. I'm just giving these examples that our students go through here. So we found that we could empathize with this, that they had not been exposed to this curriculum in their learning experience in the university. University reforms is another point, and they took it for granted that some of us would just be allowed to travel based on an email application to their register. We have to in India go through 10 pages of tour approval forms, and especially in the institute that I work in, which is with the Council of Scientific and Industrial Research, and get an approval from the director, from the CSI, and it doesn't go to the headquarters now, thankfully, but within the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, it still goes to the headquarters and to the minister level to get approval for international travel. And these are things that are unimaginable in China. So university reforms, I'm just kind of touching these points because we just have 10 minutes. But these kinds of changes within the administration of education and research have made a major difference to Chinese research capacities and encouraging people to come and work more in Chinese universities. In India, the university is now not really the most preferred job for anybody, and you've heard about the middle class now, anybody in the middle class to come to, because again, or the councils. The councils are not, despite attractive salaries, there's a major worry about the kind of bureaucratic impediments that you have to face in terms of work. Privatization of education and higher education is something that both our universities and Chinese universities seem to be going very happily about, though the nature of private investment in Chinese universities is very different from the Indian universities. We all know about the difference between, let's say, fiscal transfers and financial transfers that really don't matter very much in the university-industry linkage in China. In India, it's a very, very clear distinction. You will not find let's say, a 3-star hotel run as a private hotel within, a facility within the university campus from which the university will make money, allowing private guests to come and stay like you would find in a Chinese university. That is completely not allowed in India. You can't use federal funds for those kinds of facilities, whereas those are not considered an issue at all in China. I've lived in several universities during this project period, and we've been surprised, and And many of our other colleagues in the US and Europe are all kind of puzzled at how this kind of, quasi-private entities are allowed to function within publicly funded universities, and what does it mean? So, science policy is a third issue that we would like to take. I'll just very briefly touch upon this, because the question of innovation and the question of higher education for excellence and relevance to the Chinese society and to Indian society is something that came up repeatedly in our project. One of the things that surprised us was the weight that the state puts at the local level behind scientific and technological change and opportunities for innovation. And like you heard in your presentation, you spoke about enterprise as the driving force for development, for entrepreneurship. That is completely missing in India. Beijing alone has 70,000 municipal science commissioners. You can't imagine that scale. We don't have 7. Forget 70,000. It's a completely different question of scale, but it's also a total disengagement of the state with opportunities for entrepreneurship. You would find that in various degrees in parts of the UK, Wales, for instance, where the state the county puts in a lot of money to encourage entrepreneurship. There'd be a pile of documents that an entrepreneur needs to see. None of that is available in India. So in terms of education and for the opportunities for an educated person to establish an enterprise, to use the innovation opportunities that they have, China is way ahead of India, and that kind of, even that kind of lessons that come back into the university system is much greater in China than in India. This consultation processes that go into science policy making, consultation with student bodies, with faculty, with anybody interested in academia, with a whole range of other actors in industry, is again much greater in China than in India. I got a copy of the Chinese science and technology policy document for the midterm review. I've never gotten an Indian S&T policy document for midterm review ever.
The Chinese sent it to you.
Because we are part of the Council CSIR, and we are part of we do science policy studies. What I'm saying is that, I as not an individual, but as part of the CSIR system, I understand. But the point is that there is a much greater regard for consultation and much greater, a willingness to share documents, and these kinds of documents, official documents, saying, let people read it, let them comment on it, what are the targets set, did we achieve it, so on and so forth. The DST's science policy document in India, especially when it comes to questions of education and technology, is completely a document by DST, for DST, and it ends there. That's not what science policy is in China, and that's, again, in terms of education reform, China has made lots of these kind of changes, learning and change, trials. There is always this opinion that it's democracy and the academia is willing, what Shekhar Singh said in the previous session. Does the academia engage with policy making? I think yes, academia has made an effort. V.K.R.V. Rao, for instance, had set a completely different goal for India's food and agriculture sector. He said reducing nutritional inequalities should be the goal, not producing 250 million tons of rice and wheat or whatever. Yeah? So that's a completely different goalpost. So policymakers are totally unwilling to disengage from the kind of pipelines and structures that they have now and enable this trial and learning and tiny pilots that can change rainfed agriculture. Total unwillingness to do that. Let's stop.
Thank you very much. Are there questions or clarification? You've set up an enormous agenda of things that we can talk about later, and I've written them down so we can't forget them. Okay, so over to our next speaker, Shailly Kedia, who is expert in environment and energy, low carbon development and transitions in India and China, and international cooperation. She's a fellow of TERI, the Energy and Research Institute, and she is interested in unconventional theory, which is very intriguing. So do tell us how your interest in unconventional theory affect your experience of cooperation and co-production in China.
Okay. Yes. So, I'll be taking help of a PowerPoint.
Should I pass this to you? Do you want to just tell me next slide?
Okay, I can do that. Okay. Yeah, I can see it from there. The intent of this presentation is to really share 3 projects that we did in TERI. I was part of 2 of them, and I was still growing up in one of them. So, but I still just tried to put in together, some. So, next slide, please. In TERI, we feel like that the basis of joint research initiatives between Indian and Chinese institutes is a step forward towards forging a bilateral cooperation on the topic of sustainability through knowledge exchange and South-South cooperation. So this is just like, actually it's more like the current approach in which we have undertaken 2 projects, and in a sense, I'll just take you through the slides. It says that it has been inspired by recent discourse, a global discourse on environment as well as climate change. Next slide, please. So, there have been 3 key initiatives in TERI which involve China-India collaboration, and I would like to believe that it was co-production, and again, leave it to your judgment towards the end. So, in 1986, TERI collaborated with Tsinghua University on a study on energy, but it was more focused on energy efficiency because that seemed to be like a common concern for the 2 countries at that point of time. Then in 2008, we initiated a study with the Chinese Academy for Environmental Planning. It was called Environment and Development China and India. And then more recently in 2012, we initiated another more ambitious policy advocacy. And yes, the outcome of our co-production really has been policy advocacy because TERI, we belong to the think tank arm of TERI. And so our outcome from the co-production was more in terms of policy advocacy. And yes, and the recent one was with NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission, and it involved UNDP as well as 3 institutes from China. And otherwise, also TERI is engaged in other consortia-based projects which also involve Chinese institutes. Next slide, please. So coming to the first project, now I wasn't a part of this project, but just would like to take you through my understandings. So the project itself was titled Energy Developments in China and India, and as you can see, a comparative study of energy supply, energy consumption, and energy policy. So it was, in fact, the only comparative study which is really comparative in nature. The project period was 1986 to 1990, but of course it involved project management related procedures. Next slide, please. So in terms of timeline, the project design and funding and proposal writing, etc., it started from December 1986. Research execution took 22 months, from Feb 27, 1987 to December. It was very difficult to get the precise date, but anyway, so that is the amount of time which went into research execution, and production, meaning the production of the book, actually, because that was the output which I could understand, and of course the data and statistics mostly relied on statistical handbook and government documents, and also some interaction with industry. Funding support was from Commission of European Committees, Brussels, which funded both TERI as well as Tsinghua University. Next slide, please. Objective of the initiative was to study energy consumption in the 2 countries, which were fairly comparable in terms of population, land size, area, and number of years of planned economic development. So actually planning, the 5-year plans was one of the bases to justify the comparability between the 2 countries. And also in terms of energy intensities in various energy consumption sectors. So agriculture, industry, residential sector. And next slide, please. So this is not something, but in a sense, this was the common framework, and it was developed by both TERI and Tsinghua University. And you can see it covers dimensions of urban and rural drivers of energy consumption, as well as the industry, agriculture, you have the residential sector, and transport. And if one actually goes to the report, it sort of says that Beijing, in fact, as a city, the most common short route transport was cycle. And when you see Beijing today, so it's like, since the study, you feel like it's such a stark contrast. And whereas the most common mode of transport in India was cycle, rickshaw and auto, and you still see that prevalent in a city like India. But nevertheless, it's very interesting when you look at an old report and just compare it now. And next slide, please. So this was the approach. I wouldn't but there were 2 visits between the, so in the first visit, Indian researchers from TERI went to China in November 1987. The second research happened when Chinese researchers came to India, and they also got a chance, for example, for Indian researchers in China to visit cement plants, steel plants, which were very energy intensive. Same thing for Chinese researchers, and to understand what kind of issues they were facing at that industry level. So it was a very comparative, very collaborative research, and obviously then there was this, the publication production.
Is that 1998?
So no, that should be 1988. I'm so sorry about that. It's 1988. It's just like 3-4 months after that. I'm sorry, that was a mistake. And the reports were written parallelly. So Tsinghua University wrote the China report, and TERI wrote the India report. So that was the process that was followed. So next slide, please. Now we come to the second initiative, environment and development between China and India. And this was actually carried out under the aegis of the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, which is a very influential policy advocacy agency linked with the government of China, and it once had as its chairman former Premier Wen Jiabao. So in a sense, it's a very powerful. And on the Indian side, we had India Council for Sustainable Development, which was kind of newly formed, and we had Chinese Academy for Environmental Planning as the research institute in China, and TERI as the research institute in India. Next slide, please. So as you can see, now, the motivation behind initiating this project was the discourse on environment and development, which started in Rio, 1992 actually, and which actually had led to the formation of the China Council for Environment and Development, and had led to a whole lot of reforms in environment-related institutions. So in many ways, it was a discourse between the international environment research developed by UNEP for their global environment outlook, and then we looked at development and climate change because that was an emerging concern. Again, the activities had 2 collaborative workshops, had parallel reports, one India report, one China report, and then we had the production of the book. Next slide. So this is just a view, that there was just exchange. This is next slide, please. And that was the book, which was published in both English and Chinese. And this is the story of the cover, because if one has to look at the whole project cycle, I would say it took quite a lot of back and forth even to decide on the cover, which was agreeable to both the institute. But this is just I think it is a part of the whole process. And so this was the final one. which we felt, because the first cover actually, which is not here, had the map, which was the India and China map, which was not acceptable to either India to China. Then we decided that we'd go by some cultural figures, so which is the Taj Mahal and Temple of Heaven. So so that's it. And the next slide, please. Sorry. And this is the project which is ongoing right now, and you can see there are many actors. It's actually the most complicated project, and so I think more than the cultural differences, is the kind of number of actors and their interests, which is making this project even more complicated. So the leading agency driving this from the China side is the Department of Climate Change from the National Development and Reform Commission, which is actually as you know, it's one of the powerful agencies in China. We have the National Center for Climate Change Strategy and International Cooperation, which is also affiliated with NDRC, and then we have the Central University for Finance and Economics and Zhejiang University, along with UNDP, which gave the initial seed funding, and then it was topped up with funding from Shakti and Norwegian Embassy for the Chinese part, Shakti for the Indian part, and TERI is of course the Indian Research Institute. Next slide, please. So again, the discourse is like, the multilateral fora and the kind of similar stance that India and China both want to take in terms of low carbon development, and hence they would want to like sort of, so that was, I would say that was like one of the, even in the initial meetings, that was one of the main motivations to undertake this project. Next slide, please. But then, because then this was South-South cooperation, we felt that it wasn't, we should not be touching on aspects such as the CO2 commitments, the emission commitments. So we just felt that we should share practices. So it was more like not comparing, but rather sharing practices in the following fields: technology and innovation policies, financing, and informing national actions to address low carbon development. Next slide, please. Then when, and this is something which we have faced very often as a question, even in policy advocacy. Why are you comparing? Why are you doing China and India? What's like, they're so different countries, even in terms of like lessons learned, but so we generally like put in together like convergences and divergences. So there are convergences in terms of environmental policies in, I would say, like in national as well as multilateral fora. Both China and India set, agreed to a voluntary emissions intensity target for 2020 under the Copenhagen Accord, and they have maintained similar stances in terms of climate change in the international negotiation process. Also, in terms of national, you have like national policies for climate change, which is in place in both China and India, and there is, in terms of low carbon development, there is a heavy emphasis on energy sector, and Yuga, we had a very pleasure of her being based in TERI for part of her field work. So, she would know much better, I think. And then, obviously, there is need for, recognition for the need of cooperation in climate change, even in bilateral avenues between India and China. So there is something called a strategic economic bilateral dialogue, which takes place every year and is hosted by NDRC, alternates between hosting of NDRC as well as Planning Commission. Now, I don't know who would be hosting it because I think Planning Commission wouldn't have the same role. So, but that was like a forum. So we felt that, one of the forums where we need to take a message was the strategic economic bilateral dialogue. And next slide, please. In terms of like areas for South-South cooperation, and this project is still in process, but we did have an advanced publication in which we felt that the emerging areas for policy incubation where India can learn from China was the fiscal stimulus and banking green credit guidelines, which are in place in China. Strengthening incentive systems and R&D system as well as innovation policy, which Dr. Raina is an expert of in India. Standard system is something which we felt they had in place so that they could also strengthen the manufacturing industry in the green and low carbon sectors. And there's something called the low carbon pilots in China, which is something again India could learn from. In terms of sharing of experiences from India, we felt it was a state action plan on climate change and the whole process that was involved, the consideration of vulnerability that China can learn from. I mean, we can share at least. There was the demand response pricing mechanisms and the renewable portfolio standards. Next slide, please. And this is just like to give you a visual presentation of the kind of. And so see that the lower right-hand side is basically the launch of the advanced publication at the third strategic economic bilateral dialogue that took place in Beijing. And so yeah, that was just like part of the policy advocacy to sort of reach out to bilateral policy forums on this topic. Next slide, please. Again, this is the story of the cover. So yeah, these were the initial options that we were given, and the final one came out to be this one.
Beyond the map and Taj Mahal.
Yes. So the final one is the one which we chose was like this time we have to go beyond Taj Mahal, Temple of Heaven. So it's actually a symbol of prosperity, flowers from the two countries, lotus and peony. Next slide, please. There were other externalities, as you can see. There were a set of very beautiful songs that came out. Yuga was there, so Saransh is there, Anando is there, Yang is there. So there were actually two songs that were written in Chinese and in Hindi, and they were translated into each other's language. And we had like a very small event, you know, in which we did this cultural performance along with the presentation. So I think it's been a very nice process, and I hope it is an end, you know. Next slide, please. And so I would say that China-India co-production in sustainable development can be comparative, can be juxtaposed, can be art, and your yes.
Thank you very much. Any urgent questions? Any immediate questions? Okay, I'm sure there are lots of questions. So, are you ready?
Yes.
Been coming and going. So I now welcome Professor Nimmi Kurian, who has all kinds of versatilities: foreign policy, security, an expert on Look East, as well as welfare states, track 2 diplomacy, and various aspects of marginalisation. So you stretch across a very wide field. You're an associate professor at the Centre for Policy Research, and I assume it's going to be about foreign policy, but perhaps not. No, okay. So over to you.
Thank you, Vandra. And I would hasten to quickly add a caveat clarification that really I work on the margins of, and I identify with working on the margins of foreign policy and some of these questions which are understudied and under-theorized, and in both India and China in comparative frames. So having said that, I think what I'll try and do quickly is to give a sense of 2 projects that I've been part of, which are, both of them are continuing projects, both of them involving India and China. One is called the BCIM Forum, which is Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Forum, which I've been part of since 1999. So it's been about like 15 years. It's a track 2 initiative that brings together research institutes from the 4 countries, and so our partner institutes in China, for instance, are suitably and much to our embarrassment, because we have not been able to decenter the conversation. From the Chinese side, it is appropriately the sub-regional level, which is the Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences, which has been our partner, whereas in India, it has been, you get a sense of the centrist nature of the debate and the stranglehold of mainstream. Even in track 2, it has been pretty much two institutes which have been based in Delhi. One is the one that I belong to, the Center for Policy Research. The other is the Institute of Chinese Studies, which is funded and supported by the Ministry of External Affairs. So you see, this is in a certain sense immediately the problem, the difficulty factor in there's an asymmetry immediately out there, which again challenges the binary between the democratic political system and the authoritarian one, because it allows an quote-unquote authoritarian political system to actually has the measure of confidence to get a subnational, a sub-regional government to enter into this sustained discussion, whereas in Delhi in India it's been all Delhi-centric. So it's in a sense, so very quickly, just to give the second snapshot of the second project I've been part of, which is I've been the India representative of the India-China Institute at the New School the New School University in New York, and together with the New School University and CPR, we launched about 4 years ago a modest fledgling initiative called the Emerging Scholars Symposium on India-China Studies, and which I'm glad to say is about the only platform that exists, at least in India, which allows young scholars to present questions where there's a clear thrust for comparative treatment of a whole bunch of issues facing India and China as polities and as societies. So that is 4 years old. We are entering the 4th year. We'll be organizing the conference in December this year, and it is actually a 3-part conversation that we have every year. One of them is held in India, the other is in China, and the best papers from both India and China get to present at an international symposium at the New School. Always held, it's a calendar event for us, it's March, April of every year. So those are the two projects that I've been part of, and these are very close to, needless to say, very close to my heart, and it's been in a sense a bittersweet experience, and as well as it has had its measures of feel-good moments. So very quickly on the BCIM forum, the good part of the story is that it is the only forum really, and this is something which is really not understood or acknowledged, because it also shows the level of disinterest in Delhi towards such initiatives, because the more you move away from the capital, again it goes back to the question of where you're speaking from. You're speaking from the margins, and even if you are based in Delhi, as I am, even when one is based in Delhi, you are identifying with the margins. So therefore the question of voice and agency and agendas all kick in with a severity that is which is overwhelming. This is the only, but that apart, the feel-good part is, it is the only forum which brings together India and China at the sub-regional level, the BCIM forum, because we have no other platform which brings together these two countries. And it is a significant, in my opinion, discursive shift. It has potential to be a discursive shift, and which is we are not quite there, which is the bittersweet element that I mentioned, because there's tremendous resistance when you look at the Indian establishment towards decentering. So the discursive shift nonetheless is that it has allowed us through this, very painfully slow, where we've been always dismissed as being, just engaged as a bunch of romantics, as indulging in talk shops, and but since 1999, what it has done is to actually create a small but modest space where you've pushed the argument for disaggregating India and China, for the need to disaggregate India and China from the national to the sub-regional level, and from the sub-regional really virtually the sub-national level, which is India's northeast. Basically we are talking about, when you're looking at India and China, we are looking at their respective contiguous borderlands. So India's northeast and China's western region. So it's actually to question a very intriguing puzzle at the heart of India-China studies, and which is this: that despite the compelling immediacy of a 4,056 kilometer long border, when we typically talk of India and China, we typically think of, at least in our imaginations, in our mental imaginations, we talk about Delhi and New Delhi and Beijing, and not locations along this shared border. So locations like Lhasa and Shigatse and Nathula and Guwahati and Lido, these have been cultural signposts till about just 40-50 years old, but today stand expunged from mainstream research and policy imagination. And so this is an inheritance of loss that we thought we should kind of seriously question. It goes to the heart of, at least as far as democratic India is concerned, huge democratic deficits. So that, I said, you might get a sense of why I said it's a feel-good. At the same time, one feels a bittersweet experience, because there's tremendous amount of entrenched prejudices and opinions that you deal with at a fundamental level, at a cognitive level. So these are cognitive biases which are huge, and these are not going away anytime soon. So the difficulty factor is we can't, there's no getting away from that. Now very quickly to the emerging scholars, the young scholars symposium, that has the difficulty factor is again something which is very, one is really even quite embarrassed to say. There are three very clear difficulties that we began with, which actually is a sad reflection on the field of China studies in India when we look at it from India. One is the stranglehold of or the fact that institutions or institutes doing China work in India, there's simply no institutional conversations happening among them. Absolutely none. And there are, I could, because some of us are privy to why these institutional conversations were not happening. I won't, without disclosing, it's quite a painful, commentary on Indian academia. But just a quick hint would be, there were as banal, issues like interpersonal. It comes down to interpersonal. But for a variety of reasons, there's no getting away from it, that for a variety of reasons these institutional conversations were not happening. So you had premier institutions like JNU and Delhi University and a bunch of universities across, and there were not too many to begin with. None of them they would all be talking past each other. Their students would be doing, so it's basically you get the idea that these institutional conversations were not happening. There was tremendous amount of overlap. So that's one set of difficulty when we began 5 years ago. The second is really the stranglehold of security studies and mainstream IR, mainstream international relations. You take a look at any the PhDs or MPhils that come out. It's all over there. The dominance of security studies in terms of the research questions being asked. So it's a very parsimonious framing of the field, which again is a cause for huge concern. And lastly is the dominance of Delhi, which really cries out. It's the field of China studies in India has been hugely dominated by, again goes back to the question of location. It's been Delhi centric. So when we began, we couldn't have begun with a more challenging set of these are formidable challenges we face. But we felt precisely because of that, precisely because of the gravity of these challenges, we felt there was the need for striking and starting these conversations were even more compelling. And that is where we began this initiative, and I'm glad to say that we managed in the last 4 years to actually have a very nice and promising geographical spread in terms of the institutes from where so every year we select about 10 scholars to present. In the last 3 years we have had so there's been a fairly good geographical spread. Our call for CFP has had a very, and each year, the first year was the worst when we felt we couldn't have, we felt we were like at rock bottom. But the second year too, we did a massive outreach. We just and every year it's got better and better, and we've insisted on peer reviews, we've insisted on rigor, and we've had zero tolerance for any sort of anything other, so issue of quality has been, so some of that has really begun to kick in, and we've now started getting a fairly promising response to our initiative. So the spread now has been, we've got about just about all the major universities and institutes in the country. Our CFP receives proposals from most of these, and there's also been what the second good aspect has been, we have started getting cracking this the stranglehold of IR. We have started getting all our proposals really now are we've had papers from history, from culture, from cultural geography, from sociology, anthropology, urban studies, from art, from design. So we have actually now today one is glad to say that IR, mainstream IR and security studies, really there is from Delhi. Again, most of the responses to the CFP from Delhi are largely on security studies. That reflection is still there, but it is relativized. So last year we got about 75 applications, which I think may not seem like a large number, but frankly, for the kind of, I think from where we began, the kind of challenges with which we began, I think we are getting there. It's a fledgling initiative, a long way to go, but then so some of that interdisciplinarity has started coming in, and new fields of enquiry. So I think that's the takeaway for people like us who've worked, and there's a fair amount of unglamorous work that goes behind in putting these 1.5 day events, is to also, we have also managed in our own modest way to take it outside Delhi. And I say this in two senses. One is to, even in the, as I said, in the geographical spread, it has gone really outside Delhi. Most of our the bulk of our 10 papers or presenters come from outside Delhi. So it's like that, that has been one. And that's yes. And the second has been, we've also shifted the site from like the, where we've held these. Last year we held it in Calcutta, University of Calcutta. This year we're going to hold it in Punjab University. Hopefully some years down the line we are thinking of holding it in some location in the northeast. So so that's I think I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your frankness, which is very helpful. Now, do we have our Chinese speaker on Skype? Welcome.
Yeah, we will first play her video speech.
Right. We had an experience last year in Oxford where attempting live Skype presentations was a bit risky. And so we've learned from that that the best way to do this by remote is to have a pre-recorded presentation. And then because if Chen Yun is actually on Skype, how about it if we respond with questions immediately, just in case the electricity fails or the connection fails somewhere? Yes? So, yes. So, no, can I just introduce Chen Yun, whom I haven't seen, has a very fascinating career in journalism and communications, and then a period in arts administration, and now is it she? Yes, excuse me, runs a cultural exchange program, and she is talking from Shanghai. So a very warm welcome to you, and we will now turn to your filmed presentation.
Hello everyone, this is Chen Yuan, and I'm now in Shanghai. I work for West Heavens Project, and I'm very sorry that I cannot come to JNU this time to communicate with you in person, but I will take this chance to show you a presentation of PowerPoint through video, and I hope that for more questions and for more discussions or more potential collaborations, we can be connected through this conference and through email in the future. So West Heavens has a history of 4 years. It was initiated in 2010 by 3 professors from 3 different places in China. One is Chen from Hong Kong, who has been an international curator and critic in the past 20-30 years, and who is also a very important figure who first introduced Chinese contemporary art to the world in 1990s. And the second is a younger generation of curator and art critic and scholar, Gao Shiming, based in Hangzhou, China Academy of Art. And the third one is Professor Chen, who is a professor in cultural studies in Taiwan at National Chiang Tung University, who has been working in Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Consortium as well as many intellectual connections and social movements in the past 20 years. So it is through him that we were connected first by the Indian scholars, and also through Johnson's previous visits to India that we get to know some of the Indian artists. And in 2009 it came to them that it is a time for us to face India and to use India as a method to see China, especially in the big question of modernity. And West Heavens has always been working in 2 channels or 2 hands at the same time. One is contemporary art, art creation, art creativity, and another is social thought. So you will find these 2 mingling together and combined into one movement that as a very basic motivation and mechanism to promote and to move forward West Heavens project. In 2010, we visited India the first time. Me, Chen, along with Professor Gao Shiming in the middle, and also some of the Chinese artists. This is all our first trip to India except for Johnson. And we visited different art space, artist studios, and scholars. Elder generations like Rajeswari from CSDS, and the younger generations like Rex Media Collective from Delhi, as well as Bombay-based artists and studios. And also we visited the older generations of artists like Kurian and Nimmi in Baroda. It is through this 10-day visit that it's our first encounter to India, and a very strong one. And later in April, we invited these Indian artists to China for a field visit, and that developed into the first 2 programs of West Heavens in 2010. One is Place Time Play, India-China Contemporary Art Exhibition, which happened at the same time as the 8th Shanghai Biennial in 2010. Because Biennial is a very heated cultural event in China, as like in the rest of Asia and the world. So we used that platform, and Gao Shiming was the curator of that year's Shanghai Biennial. So we use that platform, but we make outside the exhibition venue, which is the Shanghai Art Museum, some parallel exhibitions which is in public spaces. One is the commercial space, and another is a former British Consulate General, a historical building, a priest's house and a church in the colonial part of Shanghai, a very Christian kind of culturally engaged in early history of Shanghai. And in these 2 parts, we encountered Indian contemporary art and arranged new works by these Indian artists for China audience, the very first time in history. So this is a work by a Bombay-based artist who rode a motorcycle from Bombay to Shanghai through 3 gorgeous dams. So a lot of rethinkings of the whole process of modernization and the experience of modernity between the 2 neighbors. And parallel with this exhibition in public space, we inserted 4 series forums throughout 2 months' time by inviting 7 Indian scholars from the world to China the first time, and use Shanghai Biennial as a platform for them to make public lectures. So you will find that in the audience you have different generations of Chinese audiences, and from different backgrounds. Some from art and culture, and some from just ordinary rural routine urban life. So these audiences, they all come together for this particular forum of the first. It is later described as the first Indian-China encounter, serious kind of intellectual encounter since Tagore's visit to China in 1920s. So scholars like Ashish Nandi, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Partha Chatterjee, Rajeswari Niranjana, Homi Baba, Sara Maharaj. So they are from different fields, and some of them are from within India, some of them are from outside India. But they bring us such topics as nationalism and rethinking nationalism and modernity and language and all these kind of post-colonial issues that we China never think of ourselves as part of it. And this is a really big encounter and a huge media coverage. After the event is over, many young people have been in touch with me throughout the past 4 years because they want to know more about India from a scholarly and intellectual level, and also from a social observational level, rather than a diplomatic and kind of tourist kind of or nostalgia or civilization kind of nostalgia level. So I think this is a very important starting point of our project. And in the following years, we made an artist dispatch project by inviting 2 young generation of Indian artists to Shanghai and 2 young Chinese artists in the Taiwanese curator to Delhi, and then make that into a 2-year kind of digestion and later evolve into an exhibition in Hong Kong. So these are the works. If you're interested, I can send you. I don't have time to explain in details about each of these works, but all of them have very interesting points of view to contribute to many of our conversations about China and India, comparatively speaking. But they're also very local at the same time, although they're traveling. If you're interested, I can send you the PDF version of the catalog. These are media coverage. And then we bring one Taiwan artist to Delhi to an exhibition in 2004 this year. And this is an urbanist project. I'm bringing it, this year is going to be the 4th. And in the past 3 years, we have been working with Kurian, a Bombay architecture school, and to bring each year 10 of their students and a professor to Shanghai, and to use Shanghai as a field of study for a workshop, and to bring the Shanghai architecture students, urban design students, as well as designers and artists to work with them and to rethink through Shanghai as an urban setting. And before this project, in fact, very few students in Shanghai who study architecture find urban city and people living in the city a very important subject to study. So this is a very inspiring experience, so that we no longer have to look into a West city as an iconic city, as an ideal city, but we look into each other populous kind of urban situation in today context and see what we can do and what we can imagine. So this is a study last year on a local neighborhood, working class decaying working class neighborhood, which is partly under reconstruction and dismantlement. And this is the community kind of engagement, intervention we made in that neighborhood last year. And we also made lectures, forums around that workshop. Yes, and it is very cross-disciplinary because we don't find discipline a very useful tool to talk to each other when we talk about a proper encounter. So this is a film festival, and it is the first independent Indian film festival. Films beyond Bollywood come to China. So there are a total of 35 films, Indian films, from 60s to 80s, 90s, and as late as 2010. These independent films include experimental films, early experimental films, documentary films, and fictional films. So these films came to China as a package curated by Indian film scholar Rajeswari, based in Bangalore. And we traveled, because it's in digital format, so we made a huge effort in digitalizing them and to add subtitles to them. And a lot of things were understood throughout this process of traveling, of translation, and of communication. Along with these 35 films, there are also one celluloid by a very early Bengali film director. And so there were 10 Indian film scholars and film directors also came to China and came to 4 cities in China: Beijing, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Kunming. So it's like a 1 month kind of film festival to use Indian contemporary films, and most importantly, the social thoughts that were engaged go through the cinema phenomena in India. So we also translated a book, which is the first of its kind in China, called You Don't Belong, which is also the title of this film festival, borrowed from a title of the films screened in this documentary film in this film festival, Pasts and Futures of Indian Cinema. So including many important writers from different fields of researches, how they see Indian society and history and politics through cinema. And this is a totally kind of blank area in China, because we only see cinema, we only see films from the film theories, mostly from Western film theories. And these were the discussions and talks. One of this was a film scholar from Calcutta. This is the curator Rajeswari, and we also brought that film festival later to Hong Kong and Taiwan. And in particular, for example, we have established a long-term engagement also with some particular groups like Reds Media Collective. We visited them the first time we visited India in 2010, and then we asked them to come to work with us and develop into an exhibition last year in Shanghai. It's called Extra Time. This is an installation, a video installation based on a historical Bresson photo on Shanghai in 1948. And it brought the film seen in Saraka, based on a historical photo, a theater, a play to Shanghai. And these are the installations, Indian coverage. And also we sponsor some trips, like this trip by China Academy of Art students to Dunhuang, and then make video works and exhibitions in Hangzhou and Hong Kong. We also make smaller scales of salons by inviting, and if there are any interesting Indian scholars passing by, coming to Shanghai, we also ask them to make a talk on different topics. Like this is a dean of a new art school in Delhi, and this is Rajeswari, a young scholar, a middle-aged kind of scholar in Delhi, Monica, and book launches and discussions from scholars. And it is very interesting that although this is mainly an initiative from mainland China with India, but me personally through India had got more resources and tools to understand such places like Taiwan and Hong Kong. And so also at the same time, Taiwan and Hong Kong, because some of the guests were also invited from events happening in mainland, they are very much motivated and engaged in this event, that they don't see it as like a mainland China event with India, but they also find them part of it. So, for example, this year we are also inviting a group of one filmmaker, a young generation filmmaker, to China's town Yiwu and to research on Indian South Asian communities in Yiwu, and also the global capitalism. And we also have, these are our publications you can find here. Just to wrap up, these are the catalogs. Just to wrap up everything, I just want to say that it is through this encounter between India and China, no longer through a Western discourse and Western platform, but in face-to-face kind of level, in personal level instead of any state level of effort, non-government level. We are taking initiatives, and then also the rest of Asia, like other neighboring countries, but in smaller scales, for example, like Korea, Taiwan region, and Southeast Asia, like Singapore. They are also very interested in what can be generated through this India-China dialogue, so that we no longer develop that kind of conversation into another kind of monopoly or hierarchical kind of discourse, like another two centers or two powers, as such as what we Asians have experienced in the past 200 years, to use European methodologies and ideas and theories as ours, and even to use European and history, and to see European history as ours, but neglecting our neighbors at the same time. I personally have learned a lot from this encounter with India, and this has a lot to do with the design and the people we're engaged in, this openness. And another sadness is that we find that the interest of India to China is much, much more than the interest in India from Chinese end. And a lot of kind of discriminations are already here in China, saying that the less efficiency ways of development in India, as if China has set up really itself as a really good model for the rest of Asia, which is very risky and prohibited us from seeing clearly what is happening just next door in our own neighborhood. So I think I would like to know more about your reflections, and I don't see West Heavens as purely an art project or an intellectual project, but it is more a social and historical project. Okay. So I hope it can become part of a way for us to think about conversations between other cultures, but and also within Asia, what can be really constructed and what is really independent thoughts rather than monopolized ways of thinking about each other. If you're interested, please contact me and visit our website, West Heavens, it's plural, .net. And also you can write me cmargaret@gmail.com so that we can have more a conversation. Thank you very much, and we wish this conference a big success.
Thank you very much, Chen Yun. Can you hear me? Oh, the computer is making a lot of noise. I was told by Danielle that there is a lot of noise on Skype. If you can hear me now. The suggestion is, which has implications for everyone in the room, that we take the questions to Chen Yun first, and Danielle will then type them, and by old-fashioned donkey, by email, those questions will be transported to China, and then by the time we've had the other discussion, she will hope to be able to either email her answers or appear on Skype. That seems to be a very reasonable way of dealing with technology. Okay, so that means that it will be very useful to have immediate responses to her presentation now. And will you act as scribe, Danielle? You guys are going to act, okay. So who would like to ask questions or respond to the last presentation? Danny, away you go.
It seems as if the majority of the projects are centered in China. They involve scholars from lots of different places, particularly from India, but also from other parts of the subcontinent, Southeast Asia, but that basically they're being held at various times and places in China, Hong Kong, or Shanghai, Beijing, and Shanghai Biennale, and piggybacking on that. But I just wonder about why that is, and if it is the case that, how is their organization composed? Is it largely an organization that is run purely by Chinese nationals in China that then do these kinds of cultural projects and invite people over? Or are there Indian nationals who are involved at an organizational level? And if it's only happening and being held in China, why is that the case? And are there any plans to change that?
Thank you. Who else would like to ask questions? Raji, can you put your mic on the record?
Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating, and well, I'm not an artist, but would love to come and see what's happening. When we grew up, and I know many of us from let's say who are in our 50s now, when we grew up, we had a tremendous presence of Russian cultural centers in India, reading a lot of children's literature, music, experimenting with things like lullabies, and there's a whole range of small things that we did. There is space here to do a lot more, and I really hope you would think of some of these things. And then there's a massive void that's been left by the absence of Russian cultural centers now. So I really hope you would think of some of these spaces that are available now.
Who else? Yeah.
Thank you, Madam. I have a question for Ms. Chen that West Haven always mentioned that to explore Indian is for knowing China better. So I want to know what is the new thing they found from this process. And second question is, through my knowledge, there are not so much people interested about this dialogue, but the people who has the Indian experience and Chinese experience, like Chinese study in India or Indian study in China, these kind of people, they may be interested about this dialogue, but who do not have this experience, they will not very interested about that. How do they consider this, and what do they think the thing they did is for whom? Thank you.
Other questions? May I abuse the chair? Okay. Firstly, I would like to ask who funds this, because this must cost a lot of money. And does the funding come with strings? Is there some control by the funders over the scope of what's going on? It seems to be extremely imaginative and building out, reaching out to different aspects of the arts every year. But all that requires not just brilliant coordination, but funding. So I'm a little bit curious about where that comes from. Then I'm curious about some aspects of the substance of the outcomes. One is that this question about using the comparison to reflect on your own society, in particular China, because the outreach has been mainly from India to China, if I've understood it correctly, but also reflecting on modernity. Now, what does reflecting on modernity mean? What has it actually involved? And linked to that was the remark that disciplines were not useful ways of organising the conversation between artists, and yet artistic fields were definitely the way in which the exchanges were organised from year to year. So I'm curious about how the conversation is structured, if it's not structured through disciplines. And, well, I have many questions, but perhaps the last one is that Chen Yun mentioned that that the thing is unsymmetrical, that despite all this activity, Indians seem very interested in China, but China seems not so interested in India. And I think she said that there was a sense that India's development didn't contain many lessons for China. And so my question isn't only to her, can you explain more about that in terms of art, where the difference in material levels of development shouldn't make very much of a difference in creativity. But I want to throw it out to the other members of our audience here who have experience of collaborating in big teams and co-producing knowledge with China. Were they made to feel at all inferior? Is there a prejudice against Indians in the various fields that you've worked in? Or when it comes to co-production, does all that evaporate away, as it does so often when there are international tensions, but a great deal of collegiality amongst ordinary people, and in this case, scientific experts? Okay. Now what are we going to do? That will now go into the machine and be fed to China, and the answers will come back.
Yeah, we'll come back
Okay.
after your discussion.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is turn to the other papers, or incorporate Chen Yun's observations in a discussion of 3 other papers. Remember that Raji was talking about the potentials and also some of the problems of multi-center, multinational, multidisciplinary projects, very ambitious. And Shailly was talking about 3 or maybe 4 big projects of collaboration over a long period of time between India and China, mainly on the environment. And Nimmi was talking about 2 major collaborations between countries of South Asia involving India and China, and then young scholars. So there were a huge range of questions that were generated by those very rich presentations. So who wants to kick off? Yes. Can you shout loudly and indicate your name, please?
I'm Mallikarjun, I'm from Chinese Studies. I have a couple of questions. First, I will start with all the questions on the environment. India and China had a bilateral climate change agreement in 2009, and it was to be revived after 5 years, and in 2015. And in the previous statement in the recent visit of Chinese president, we talked about the climate negotiations in terms of global things, but we did not do anything in the bilateral cooperation. So do you see that as a going back, we are not going to cooperate in that? That is the first question. And the second question is that as far as you have compared the things, and cooperation, and you have taken up 80s and other thing in 90s, but now the proportion of carbon emissions are very different. And if we are seeing China is number 1 and it has 3 times more carbon emissions than India. So do you think that if we are taking till now we had something similarities, both were having low carbon emissions per capita, but now the things are changing. So do you think India and China can cooperate in climate negotiations in this? This is very controversial because in the last 1 decade, from 2001 and 2010, China has increased its carbon emissions 3 times and India has increased 2 times. So there are vast inequalities in the positions recently in the environment sector. So can they cooperate? That is for environment. And then ma'am, regarding the Chinese studies, in fact I attended the second symposium at Delhi University. So it was my in the initial days when I came to Delhi. And if you are seeing that Chinese studies is Delhi centric, the entire academics related to China are also Delhi centric. This is one of the major reasons. And if you go and if you try to find some international relations institute in Bangalore or Hyderabad or Chennai, you don't have any. And I don't know whether they can establish. And if you see something, you can find more globalization in South India.
Yes.
And you don't find any institutes teaching globalization or international politics. This is a fact. And people like me, I am from Hyderabad. I have to travel till here to study because we don't have any such institutes which offer any such kind of things, and especially East Asian studies. And then there are inequalities and quality standards in teaching also, which are very. And now, as far as your ICI program is there, and in the symposium, it's only for people with higher level of education, MPhil or PhD. Now, if you want economics, I don't think anybody would, especially in business management. Now, people go for MBA and then they don't continue. Now, where do these people can come in this kind of symposiums? If they are people who are actively engaged in between India and China in terms of economics, and they, because when I was in my graduation, now that guy is trading with he is located in Delhi, and he has business partnerships with China. And now these kind of people can provide more inputs, but they don't have the higher level of education to provide us the new narratives in this thing. So this can be used, because especially in business, I don't think they are going for higher studies. They go for more quicker entrepreneurship. And now if you want new narratives, you have to allow the MA level at least to create something. So this is my suggestion.
Normally we have a big round of questions, but that was so rich that I think we'll ask the two presenters to whom it's most relevant to respond now. Okay?
So there were two questions. One was on bilateral cooperation between China and India, per se, on climate change, vis-a-vis like their cooperation, keeping in mind the multilateral negotiations. I wish I was in the government to give you like a clearer picture. But yes, we did like keep in mind the 2009 agreement between China and India. And we try to like engage with the ministries with that regard as to how we can align with the activities that could be done under the agreement of 2009, and which were to be revived like in future. But from what our understanding was that in India the coordinating agency was the Ministry of Environment and Forest, and from China the coordinating agency was the NDRC. And as a researcher, I can only speak as a researcher, not even as an expert. I'm still a researcher. Is I think the two agencies function very differently. Ministry of Environment and Forest is not as strong as NDRC. Neither was Planning Commission when it was there, and so the kind of language also, which which we understand that NDRC was trying to communicate to MOEF. And MOEF only saw climate change and low carbon development in terms of negotiations, because MOEF was the agency which leads the negotiations, but NDRC goes beyond negotiations. So I hope that, and this is just like, lessons from the previous project on environment and development, that our environment agency, MOEF, and high level attention that is required for environment is strengthened in India. And then I think there could be a very strong South-South cooperation, at least between China and India. And also, we know that NDRC is, and maybe other agencies also in China are keen, and they are building towards the South-South cooperation fund. On the second thing, which is certainly something which is very political in nature, and wasn't really the intent of these projects, but the common stand will still be equity. In terms of socio-economic situation in the two countries, and climate change and also adaptation, I would still see that wherein like the peaking, China would be prepared for peaking, and they're really taking serious action towards mitigation actions, could be ready for peaking or like taking on some non-voluntary commitments or deep obligations earlier than India. But I don't see that happening till 2020. But again, this is really a researcher's perspective. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Quick response. Yes, absolutely. When I said it was really a reflection on the field of China studies, really not just on the young scholars, because the broader field really what ails the field of China studies is really its parsimonious framing. And in a sense, the initiative really came out of a sense of deep sense of frustration because of this parsimonious framing. And if you look at a quick snapshot of do a lit survey, what do you get? most of the themes that, or like most of the work that has been done, and this is a very general comment, I mean caveats notwithstanding, is that largely there's been India-China comparative studies have largely obsessed over and been fixated over the competition versus cooperation binary, whether relations are going to be competitive or cooperative, and it's been as stifling and as unimaginative a field as that. So what you get, but something, so that's in a sense the sense of frustration. And ours, and point well taken about, getting in voices from the business, local business persons and those who have field experiences who can bring inputs, yes, but as I said, the larger, I would still say there's a huge amount of potential for, and precisely because we are beginning with such a parsimonious and such a narrow frame that there are any number of, or let's say, subaltern voices. There's huge scope for bringing subaltern voices into the conversation, because the conversation at present is too narrow and too obsessively fixated on one or two aspects, and the actors and the agency and agendas both are issues that are deeply fraught and stand that really reflects the field of the study. And we have only begun to kind of, as I said in our fledgling initiative, just begun to kind of make a small but what we feel a modest foray towards, a modest crack at it. Thanks.
Other questions? Please. Not a question, a comment? No, okay. Anybody else?
Okay, I have a question. One of the major issue I have with all kind of co-productions and co-production and research projects, that a lot of these enterprises are run on the pilot basis. Researchers from both sides basically get engaged with a lot of enthusiasm, say for 3 years. Research starts the inception happens. People work very hard to basically let it grow. In the 3rd year, when all has come round, when people are full of energy, you are told funding has been cut. So whenever it comes to any scientific, whether it's in any academic enterprise, I think before we talk about co-productions, we have to pay attention to the sustenance. How are we going to sustain those co-productions? We have to tackle that meta layer right from the start. We cannot ignore that, because otherwise what happens, some very able researchers from both sides end up becoming consultants. They move out of academia, and we have a serious question of throwing away all the knowledge in which we invested. And there is another issue of all of us have suffered from that. Topics becoming sexy and non-sexy. So this is something has been the bane of my research life, and I'm sure all of you share that sentiment to some extent. So my request to all of you who are so putting your energy and hard work in championing the cause of co-production, please tackle this issue as well. Thank you.
Okay. No further questions, she says rather nervously. Well, then may I abuse the chair and ask some questions to everybody. Raji, what you were doing is just about the most complicated management task that can be around. Different disciplines, a number of different institutes in more than one country. I've been there myself, and so perhaps some of the questions I have are because of the resonance with my own experience. But how do the disciplines, the different distribution of disciplines, manage to communicate across borders. How do you establish a hierarchy in which people respond to deadlines and deliver what they promise? No, it's not easy. How do you incentivize when there's no obvious, simple hierarchy with a director with a big hammer that they can wield over everybody else? When you've got something very responsible and creative, a network of people rather than a hierarchy, how do you coordinate and incentivize and maintain discipline? Between India and China, is there the same kind of culture in the relationship between field or data gathering and writing up? So often the writing up period takes much longer than we ever planned for when we proposed a project. And in my experience, it's 2x in the field equals 1x writing up. And that is even tight. Are there differences between India and China, and what do you do about it if there are? How do you deal with language? Yeah? Does everybody speak in English? Okay, so that's one set of questions about that kind of project, which I imagine will happen more and more frequently. To Shailly, your work is intended to be useful. It's analytical work of a high order, it's comparative work, but right the way through, there's the sense that underlying it is a wish to be useful and a wish to enter the policy process. So I'm just wondering what kind of assumptions, whether you've ever had a conversation before a project started and before you identified policy issues, policy relevance, implications for policy, what the assumptions are about the capacity of the state, of the policy process to listen to your results, particularly in both countries. And I say this frankly because in economics, and that's where I used to work, there is an assumption that the state has infinite capacity and that the state will listen, and that the state will listen to common sense and implement things. And then economists are a bit sort of quizzical when it doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen very often. And Nimmi, your Bangladesh, Burma, China, India project is very fascinating, and I just wondered what the addition of Bangladesh and Burma adds to the complexities of the relationship between China and India. You didn't have time to talk about that. And then the new school project is obviously organized through the USA. And the way you described it, the USA was the apex meeting when the 10 scholars had been weeded out from India and China. So sitting above the India-China relation is the USA in that case. And I wonder there, it's a bit like the inverse of the Bangladesh-Burma question. What difference to the interactions between India and China happen when you have Big Brother funding and watching you from the USA? And then perhaps to everybody, you said something very, very interesting about despite the 4,000 kilometre border and the importance of the border to politics, that there aren't border studies. And I was thinking, no, there aren't border studies. And what else are there not studies of? We're talking about co-production, we're talking about not just comparing India and China, but the links between India and China. How much work is being done on the Brahmaputra and the rivers that flow between India and China, and all the problems that arise from that? And are there other things? We had cybersecurity, we had the net earlier today, but what else flows between? We have migrants, teenage migrants coming across for education, but are there other flows that happen across the borders? And are the borders significant for other reasons? And what might be being done? That's a kind of kite-flying question. And then this whole business of institutes not talking to each other. My experience is that institutes don't talk to each other full stop, that it's hard in Britain, it's hard in India, it's also probably harder in China. And I remember when my husband Gordon's books were given to the CSDS, then there were very few institutes. There was Shantiniketan and there was CSDS and there was some foreign policy training on China to Indian diplomats, and they didn't talk to each other. And one of the reasons that was given at the time, and this is a long time ago, was that in the fallout, the political fallout after the '62 war, the people who had been encouraged to study China in India and who'd been given a lot of help to learn Chinese and then develop their own disciplinary competence, they were reviled and they were asked not to teach. There was a huge kind of reaction against China in the Indian Academy writ large, and that reaction is being rehabilitated. But I wondered, I know that the scholars of the first generation after India's independence went through a period of ostracization and of isolation, and I wondered how India is healing itself, because the issue of the '62 war is still, I think, one of silences. It's one which isn't fully healed, and so I'm curious about the legacy of that on the not talking between institutions in India. Should we answer? Chen Yun has actually replied. So once?
Okay, should we take that then?
No, let's have your responses first.
Okay.
We start with the most difficult ones. Incentivized to deliver on time, impossible. It's just been really impossible. There've been special issues planned, joint papers planned. I mean, the work is there. We've got written material, but just finish it and get it to the journal. I mean, that's been extremely difficult. And partly yes, because of disciplinary hierarchy, and because of some of these, well, conceptual, misunderstandings of kind of inclusion, exclusion. What do we mean? And so there's a lot of for the first couple of meetings we had to actually struggle to get across what we meant by inclusion and what they meant by inclusion, and both of us to share a common language in terms of just the disciplinary content. Language, yes, English has been a problem, but my counterpart there in China, Xie Wu, had 3 students who spoke good English, and therefore they kind of worked with the team, the Chinese team that worked with us, and made things much easier. In terms of the areas that are not studied, just to add to this point about border studies and what else, some of these, let's say, technologies and the kind of exchanges that have happened in the past, are kind of, we mentioned history, the modern era. Historians of science have looked at a bit of that, but then I think it's not even like scratching the surface. There's been a major set of exchanges of knowledge across the borders, right from shipping along the coast. It's just been, coast, craft, building, the kind of material, fishing hooks, and there's a whole range of things that need to be looked at. I'm sure there are people doing all this. It's just people to kind of find these people and talk to them. Buddhism is another flow.
Yes.
The Liying Temple in our visits to Hangzhou, we went to the Liying Temple, and it's fascinating. And there's lots of India there in that temple, in that entire belt. And the assumption that a part of Mount Abu flew there, and that's how these temples were established. There's a lot of history, folklore kind of stuff to be explored, but of course a lot of modern science questions, not the competitive ones, but really comparative and again collaborative kind of research that can happen. So I just stopped there.
Thank you very much. Shailly.
Yes, with regard to the assumptions but also processes, so far I would say that in terms of like the engaging with the policy process, let's say the later project on the Indian side, as well as we did like sort of target a bilateral forum which involved both policy makers and an official bilateral forum, that is. So that and we assume that there would be support for us to present our work at that bilateral forum. But also at the domestic levels, I would say one major factor which for us, to sort of work in these kind of projects is we formed a steering committee in India, which was chaired by a member of Planning Commission. So a government representative right, at that stage, and having other representatives, not just from the governments, but also other organizations, other energy experts, that is. So that is how we worked in the India side. And on the China side, we already had NDRC driving the whole process, because in fact it was TERI, and in fact the one major factor I would say is the leadership of TERI, which I would say Dr. Pachauri, because of his charismatic personality and his perseverance. He did approach NDRC directly at the minister level, and in China it is very hierarchical. And so if the minister didn't, I don't think so, we felt that the cooperation from the China policy side was there. The challenges were actually the ones which actually asked Dr. Raina, is the timeliness, etc., because let's say the first China-India project, it was written in Chinese, it was translated to English, and then editing it was it was really time consuming. So there are these aspects that take time, but as a think tank, I would say certainly in terms of ensuring the policy is with us, the leadership really is a major factor, and then all these kind of mechanisms which we put into place so that it's connected to policy at all times. And so, for example, in the China-India project, we already have 2 steering committee meetings. Of course, now the steering committee would be revisited because the planning commission is no more, in the sense, in that sense. So we have challenges of these kinds. And so, of course, in that sense, our assumption was that NDRC and Planning Commission are a good pair, because So, but yes, it's complicated, and we evolve. That's the process. In terms of your second question, in terms of knowledge flow, our previous project, the environmental development one, also sort of highlighted that there is a requirement of knowledge flow in terms of disaster risk reduction and early warning systems between the 2 countries. So that is very important in terms of the kind of changing climate. I think that is one area we highlighted that could be an area of China-India cooperation as well.
Thank you.
Should I? No. Okay. Okay. So, Barbara, you asked about the addition of Bangladesh and Myanmar, and the inverse of that with US. So, very interesting. It really goes to the core of you capture it really well there. So. The addition of Bangladesh and Myanmar, it really, as I said, it's more of an aspirational sort of potential, because the potential is really not realized because it's runs aground severe geopolitical, geostrategic links, because realities, because these are quote unquote sensitive border regions that we're talking about, which abut and with a severe long history of miscommunication and lack of communication being, and so the trust deficit is of legendary proportions. So there's no getting away from that. So that is where most of your all your good ideas really run ground against and come to kind of it just so it's aspirational, but at the same time there are these sub-regional initiatives, and like I said, the BCIM, and this year, for good or bad, one can't quite. I have mixed feelings, and it's a again like a bittersweet experience. The governments in both India and China have co-opted the Track 2 dialogue and formalized this as a Track 1 initiative. So now it really is a moment of, it's a moment of transition, huge transition, where this good idea goes from here. Because for 15 years that we have kind of slogged to kind of create a cognitive consciousness of trying to say that we need a borderlands perspective which is different from a Delhi-centric one. So now when the state co-ops it, there is at one level a grudging acceptance, an acknowledgement that you need to bring some of these subnational agendas to the mainstream, and but at the same time there's a far less innocent agenda which could be that these could get swarmed and co-opted into a very, very mainstream consciousness. So that's it's really at that point poised at a very delicate period. So that's one, and it's really a vision, and as I see it this more like a double vision, where the border region is suspended between what I see as two colliding visions, so to speak. One is a very feel-good liberal vision of prosperity and growth, which is being pushed very aggressively by both the Indian and the Chinese state. So you see some of these sub-regional initiatives really, actually the timing of it is that both in the Indian and the Chinese case, the state is stepping into its periphery, armed with a very powerful discourse of prosperity and growth, and armed with an even more formidable arsenal of resources. So you see that that is where the liberal vision is, but again, as I said, it is a double vision. It's the border region really remains suspended between this liberal vision, which, as I say, is accompanied by a long trail of geopolitical anxieties. So there's a liberal vision which has this long tail of geopolitical anxieties which are very, very entrenched, and which is why, unfortunately, as I said, I can't say it better, that the border region remains suspended between this double vision. So that's where I feel that it's aspirational, it has huge discursive potential, but it depends really at sensibilities in Delhi and Beijing about what we make of the addition of Bangladesh and Myanmar. Because an idea, there's no denying it's a good idea, but there's only so much you can run with it. Yeah. So that's the reality check. And as per Gaurav, your point about the TNS organizing it, the fact that it is being kind of the US sitting on top, and because they are the ones, the question of funding, they are the ones who have funded this. So yes, but yes. But there again, I would hasten to say, many of us who signed up for this, we signed up for this with our eyes wide open, because it is at the end of the day an indictment on our own respective countries that we have not been able to install or create a congenial intellectual and policy climate to debate some of these questions in our own countries. So even when we have the intellectual capital, even when their sensibilities are available, many of us are hemmed in because we don't have we just have not been able to, and it's a collective indictment. It's not just it's an indictment both at the policy level as well as at the research level, and especially more so by mainstream IR, which takes its cue from status frames. So it's an indictment on all of us and in research community as well. So so basically the intellectual and policy climate to debate some of these questions within India and China within common comparative frames has simply not been there. So some of us, when we saw the TNS, the new school offering this, we signed up for it with eyes wide open, because we thought still it is, and at the end of the day, as I saw it, at least when I went into it, I saw it as an opportunity, a long overdue opportunity to to learn to unlearn a whole baggage of caricatures that both these societies have had towards each other. So to forget the question of even learning and creating processes and approaches, it's really fundamentally more about learning to unlearn. So some of that I thought we got a start when we did. And just the final point, Barbara, you asked about border studies. Really, elsewhere in the world, border studies is a thriving field. It's thriving, and it can't be more dormant or dead in India. And I say this because of the same reasons that for instance, if you look at a discipline like mainstream higher, it tends to take its cues largely from status frames. So you have, it doesn't mean that questions like the Brahmaputra about water use and water management are not being studied. Yes, they have been studied. There's tomes, there's tremendous amount of literature out there. But the question at the end of the day comes down to the power to frame. How are you framing many of these? And many of these, mind you, are resulting in a hysterical debate of huge proportions, where you're actually securitizing and creating this whole vocabulary of water wars.
Yes.
So the China as the hydro hegemon. Yes. So these are not innocent, framings. So many of us, some of us, I for instance work on the same issues like transborder resource governance, but at the end of the day, the large bulk of literature that's being generated tends to hyperventilate and create these fractured frames within which. So questions like, when I would, as a researcher, would say these are questions because these are flows, at the end of the day, these are flows and networks. Yes. These need to be articulated and defined as regional public goods, because these are environmental goods and bads. But that's really an outlier position. That's really so I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank heavens for outliers. Now we're running slightly late. Our distinguished last speaker has arrived, I think. And my question to the organisers is, can we allow the time to read them and to include Chen Yun in the final wrapping up? Yeah.
I'll just read it.
Please do.
Yes, okay. This is Chen Yun's responses. These are Chen Yun's responses to the questions about her talk on West Heavens, which is the cultural organization that she is responsible for. She says, West Heavens is funded by the Hong Kong-based Moon Chu Foundation, and some of the early projects were funded by Han Art TZ Gallery, which is in fact Johnson Chang Zongzun's, one of the three initiators, own gallery. It is interesting to think that the money comes from a place which has just returned to China from UK, but we never see Hong Kong as a possible connection between India and China in a post-colonial context. I would say that's not entirely true. I refer you to Akbar Abbas. Post-revolutionary China has always seen itself as having had a different history from a post-colonial India, which is true in many ways. But we were also blinded by many shared experiences. It is a complicated problem that I cannot really go into detail, but China has always exaggerated our commonalities with the West and the Asian that develops itself into a West, like Japan, which we do not want to extend to in our reference to India. She says the modernity exactly functioned at this point in the sense that the desire for development has blinded us looking properly into our neighbors, because we gradually lose the tool to understand modern and contemporary India except for those tools from the West. In other words, we do not see each other directly and listen to the other side. The Cultural Revolution has had high impact on some generation of Indian intellectuals, but we have not heard from Indian intellectual and art world since Tagore. So there has been an imagination of China in India, but there has been very little imagination of India in China as such. And in response to this discussion about the Russian element, she says, The Russian element has a lot to do with the socialist era of Nehru, which is more of a state level or up or down ways of cultural influence based on government policy, similar to the Russian influence to China decades ago. West Heavens is very clear that although we do welcome support from government, we want to work through art and social thought, but in a personal level, not necessarily popular. So that experience can go through these projects along with expressive creativity and reflections. State policy is one thing, but the common ground, and especially a productive common ground, will not come into being only because of state policy, especially there is no permanent friend, but only permanent interest between states. It's interesting. So how can this ground be cultivated? West Heavens invited artists and scholars to meet and produce works and discourses independent of the state, but in a personal level so that personal affections can be established and developed into something more extensive than the artwork or the exhibition and the intellectual writings themselves. There are many things to be unfolded in the methodologies of evolving projects in West Heaven, but one thing is that it is a kind of friendship based on a belief that we are not assuming another superiority, as will happen in most so-called international exchanges. And on that, we finish. That's a very juxtaposed kind of idea.
Yes. Okay, well, the abiding thing that I will take away is that co-production enables us to learn to unlearn the caricatures. And we've made a heroic attempt at doing that over the last 2 hours. But I think we're slightly late, so without more ado, I'm going to thank everybody enormously for participating and end the session. Thank you.